Are you looking for a satisfying Western game to scratch the itch while we watch the clock and count down the innumerable days before your great-grandchildren can finally sink their teeth into Red Dead Redemption 3? Because let's face it, gaming might be a bit past us at that point, boys. Might I suggest Call of Juarez Gunslinger? This is one of those games I've played countless times over the years since its launch in 2013, because I absolutely love it. It's a weird game considering what preceded it was a steaming, stinking pile of turd, maybe worth a video of its own someday, because it truly is pretty rubbish. And yet this final foray into existence for the Call of Juarez franchise was truly spectacular. In this game, we become Silas Greaves, a bounty hunter with a generic bounty hunter name, tasked with taking down some of the meanest figures in the West in a story told through the lens of retrospect and the words of an unreliable narrator. We learn of his quest for vengeance and shoot people. A lot of people. I can still hear the screams. This arcade-styled run-and-gun first-person shooter is exciting, thrilling, fast-paced and dramatic. The perfect game to kill a few hours with here and there. Some people love the game so much they've sunk hundreds of hours into it. I really don't know how they've accomplished that. The main story is 3 hours long at best, but hey, if that isn't a testament to how good this game is, I don't know what will sway you. As things stand, the game costs £2 on Steam, 2 of your finest sterling for what's on display. If you've never played this title, I think that's a bargain. In today's video, I bid to explain why this game is so brilliant, how it accomplishes what it sets out to do, how it achieves being pure fun despite also being a short-lived campaign of madness, and why, if you've never played this game, you should give it a whirl. Now, perhaps oddly, when taking into consideration the game's overall arcadey nature, Call of Juarez Gunslinger is incredibly plot-heavy. We play as a legendary bounty hunter named Silas Greaves, whom we meet as he arrives in Abilene, Kansas in 1910, when the height of the West is long past and the old man walks into the Bull's Head Saloon, where he strikes up a conversation with those within. He introduces himself and is immediately recognized as a legendary bounty hunter. The 5 within have various reactions to Silas Greaves' arrival. Ben, the bartender, is a bit nervous. The young man Dwight is thrilled to meet one of his heroes. He's also a young man named Dwight in Abilene, Kansas in 1910. I wonder who he could possibly be. Molly is just happy to have a customer, I suppose. Jack is skeptical that the man before him even is Silas Greaves, and the old man Steve, he's just there for vibes. Nonetheless, the group quickly strike up an arrangement with the old man to buy him drinks in exchange for his life story. A story that promises to differ from anything they read in dime novels. And it's these chapters that constitute the gameplay element. We experience the events of Greaves' life through his memory, and that grants the game the freedom to have quite a punchy art style, it must be said. But we basically play through the levels as Silas Greaves narrates and recounts what happened moment for moment. And it's very swiftly established that Silas Greaves is quite the unreliable narrator, though the extent of that is unclear. At first, however, it's shown through him bouncing off those he's telling a story to. In the first chapter, where Greaves recounts being a part of Billy the Kid's gang for a brief period, Dwight may very well embellish the story somewhat, interjecting a duel between Silas Greaves and Pat Garrett that just simply didn't happen.
That ain't what I meant when I said I met Pat Garrett.
So the missions often entail on-the-fly corrections to the storyline in this vein, where Dwight's, for instance, romanticised idea of how things happened is challenged. And it's not just Dwight that interjects with facts that Silas objects to. The other characters have recollections and understanding of events that contradict Silas's story, and these characters in turn point out continuity flaws in Silas's own commentary. So in a way we have multiple unreliable narrators rather than just one, although the most consistently involved is Silas Greaves himself. And this onion of questionable credibility allows the storytelling to directly influence the gameplay. The game frequently shows us one or two, if not multiple versions of the same event, with slight variations in occurrences and outcomes depending on who's telling the story. And that allows the first-person shooter element to be far less predictable. You don't know when the narration is going to interrupt and completely transform what you're doing.
Sorry, kid, but that just wasn't the way it happened.
This keeps the relatively straightforward flow of gameplay fresh. Every occurrence feels relevant to Silas's story. Details in the world and even your pathway forward transforms as the narrative is fed to us. We get the impression Silas is winging huge chunks of the story as he goes along, talking himself into corners before miraculously finding a way out. And the game's constantly negotiating the idea of what's true within the context of the story and what's simply false. And that's something that at times is made abundantly clear, but is often left for us to work our way through. This allows us to exotically tangle with various historical outlaws in whichever way would be most satisfying and most heroic, without having to bend too far away from the truth, or at least acknowledging that the truth may be different, essentially providing a lens through which any historical inaccuracies may be forgiven, even if being accurate is obviously not the point of the game. Nonetheless, it's a topic that has a tendency to crop up when it comes to games that deal with historical events, historical figures, or even simply a vague historical setting. So even while it's not a prerequisite to be diligently historically accurate, you can see the benefit the unreliable narrator approach grants us here, as the game has to do much less legwork to justify its own insanity. It's open to interpretation how much of what we're doing is an extension of this core literary device, and while that is a fringe benefit, that does not make the unreliable narrator necessarily easier to pull off. If anything, it's an incredibly challenging angle through which to deliver a story. We're not getting an absolute account of events, nor are we experiencing them as they occur, with the protagonist's perception having only so much impact. There's room for entire plotlines and chapters to just be canon nonsense, and since fictional storytelling is very much so the art of convincing people with nonsense anyway, attempting to convey that the reader, the consumer, the observer, whatever word you want to use, should not be convinced by the nonsense, is an incredibly tricky and fine line to walk. If you don't play into the concept enough, we as the consumers of that media will be too convinced by the unreliable narrator, thus making the revelation it's all bollocks a bit harder to digest. However, if you lean too far the other direction, you end up with pure nonsensical storytelling that doesn't really attempt to bargain with your suspense of disbelief. So there has to be a baseline of sincerity in Silas Greaves' greatest hits recollection. So in the context of the story, the broad strokes of what he's going over does happen to be true, but he's prone to exaggerating aspects, perhaps even his own involvement in events, at the expense of downplaying the contribution of allies. Perhaps Greaves portrays himself as more of a one-man army than he truly was. He deliberately leaves out or muddies details, and his reasoning for doing all this is not without an ultimate narrative purpose. We're not supposed to trust that Silas is telling the whole truth, however we're supposed to believe the general outline of it. But what's most important is that we question why he's not being entirely forthcoming with his 5 attentive listeners. Aside from free booze that may very well be a realistic, valid reason for telling people your life story, what is it that compels Mr. Greaves to take time out of his day to tell these 5 strangers, one of whom may or may not be the future president of the United States, his life story? And what is the obscuration of the whole truth intended to accomplish? It's not to make him seem like a bigger hero than he actually is, it's a notion he himself shoots down. The answer, of course, is in the beginning. You see, Silas Greaves riding into Abilene, Kansas in 1910 is not the beginning of him orally conveying memoirs. It's the ultimate chapter of the story he's telling. A story that began over 40 years prior, with the murder of his older brothers outside Juarez, Mexico in 1868, at the hands of 3 figures named Johnny Ringo, Roscoe Bob Bryant, and a fellow named Jim. Everything beyond that point is a quest for vengeance against these 3 men. The story sees him catch up with Johnny Ringo early, and while he continuously brings up Roscoe Bob Bryant in particular, it takes him a while to actually get round to why he's chasing these men. And while he does get around to explaining it, when he does, he deliberately misses out giving out the surname of the Jim fella. He does this before jabbering on about other antics and focusing on his pursuit of Roscoe Bob Bryant, until ultimately it tests the patience of his listeners, until the one that knows more than he's letting on slips up.
So are you gonna answer the question?
What question is that?
Jim Reed. Did you ever find him?
Reed was indeed that son-bitch's surname. That's right, Ben.
The game doesn't linger on how Ben knew that Jim Reed was the Jim Silas Greaves mentioned, but once Reed's full name is dropped, Greaves cracks on with the story and recounts the dramatic fashion in which he finally dispatched his penultimate nemesis. However, as the story before this point and following details, Roscoe Bob Bryant always evaded him. He doesn't show up in any of the missions. Maybe it's because he actually died in 1878, at least in real life apparently, or maybe it's because the beginning of this story, which is also the ending, is where he has found Bob, playing the role of a humble bartender named Ben in a saloon in Abilene, Kansas. And this entire story and all of its fuzzy details were intended to gauge his reaction and confirm his true identity, so Silas can deliver the final stroke of ice-cold vengeance. but ultimately that's up to us, along with what lesson we want to exact upon this narrative. We can choose to follow through and have Silas exact his revenge, verifying in a duel that he is the legendary gunslinger he claimed to be. But how much of a victory is it really for an experienced, seasoned gunslinger to challenge an elderly man years removed from any relevant practice? Above all else, the revenge ending embeds that Silas Greaves' quest for revenge transformed him into a monstrous killer no amount of wrongdoing could ever justify. And now that journey's over, all that remains is the husk where his soul once was. In this ending, the unreliable narrator walks away the ultimate villain. However, particularly towards the back end of the game, a key note of moral awareness frequently brought up is Silas contemplating the destruction he's caused on his path for vengeance, and how it's effectively consuming all that he is. He's haunted by a lifetime of killing in the name of the dead, and from that lens, the greatest revenge he can exact upon Roscoe Bob Bryant, a version of Ben that no longer exists, is to reclaim his own soul by simply declaring no more. In this ending, Silas acknowledges that while he walked the path of a killer, Roscoe Bob Bryant walked the path of redemption. In simple terms, there's still the offender and the offended, but both characters have been each other. It's easy enough to seize retribution against bad men that wronged you when they're still bad men. But what satisfaction can you truly get from killing a man completely detached from the villain you've imagined for over 40 years? And when you look in a mirror and realise you yourself are more similar to that visage, what right or justification do you truly have? As for the unreliable narrator portion, Silas Greaves is not vindicated as a legendary gunslinger in this ending. Instead, it shifts focus to Dwight Eisenhower and becomes a lesson for him. A lesson about building things, not tearing them down out of anger and spite. The notion of a man's life and very essence being consumed with rage does not necessarily have to be rooted in a true story to prove to be a valuable cautionary tale, to serve as an unforgettable life lesson, one that piggybacks on the real-like's extraordinary life to hammer home this critical point, that the truth about the past is nowhere near as important as working to build the future you want to be true. Perhaps it's not an original moral of the story, but it is a uniquely packaged one. And of course there are other layers that the unreliable narrator touches down upon as well, perhaps most noticeably the blending of myth and fact in the Wild West. After all, it's a notoriously romanticized time period, and I mean, why wouldn't it be? It was a place and time defined by individualism, adventure, the idea of leaving one's very life behind and building a better one against the odds in a harsh land equipped with little more than grit. A place where people took fate into their own hands and started anew. A period of a young country's history defined by prospects and possibility. It's a natural cultural breeding ground for myth and legend. And so naturally stories arose from this time. Stories of real people, lawmen, outlaws, the struggle against the elements, against nature. It makes for fascinating stories, many of which pertained to actual people who existed. And with often a lack of direct sources, stories get passed down verbally, from mouth to ear, sat around campfires, and at bars. Details got fuzzy. Dime novels would arise to tell melodramatic stories. Immeasurably romanticized and exaggerated, the line between fact and fiction became blurred. And then Western films and the like came along to stir the pot further. Gunslinger plays into this folklore hotbed, using retrospective storytelling to deal with a variety of outlaws, a variety of lawmen, at different points in time in different places, in a concise story. And Silas Greaves' less than reliable account allows the narrative to acknowledge and flirt with the idea of the West being nothing like the popular exaggerated angle through which it is often viewed. It's understood we're experiencing a highly exaggerated version of events, and it's largely left open to interpretation as to how exaggerated they are. The game is very aware of what on average makes westerns appealing, and is careful to both deliver that and ensure we know how it's constructed. This allows it to be a 3-hour whirlwind of unadulterated, shameless western chaos, because its intention to be those things is what leaves it room to inspire an interest in the real history, something the game appetizes through the nuggets of truth, small bits of historical information on characters, events, gangs, organizations, groups of people, with some Juarez lore more gently applied here and there, to sell this idea of a more tame but no less interesting reality, while also serving as a reward for going out of your way to find them in the levels. Not that they're hard to find, they just require a modicum of attentiveness. It just adds an extra layer to that interactive storytelling the game thrives on. Overall, while it's no masterpiece, the storytelling is highly intelligent, thoughtfully crafted, and justifies its runtime beautifully. My favourite aspect of the game is how unique the story feels, as the layers come together to deliver something unforgettable. Gunslinger's art style is another standout point for this game. This game doesn't opt for realism or as close to fidelity as possible for its time as such, and that's what gives it a very timeless finish, oddly. I find realism to often be a fool's game, even in the modern gaming landscape where such a feat is reliably possible, even plausible. It's one thing to make a game look realistic, but sometimes nothing beats a more exaggerated style, intended to impress not through graphics, but art direction. The art style is intrinsically linked to the storytelling here, akin to comic books in a way, probably more akin to the art found in old dime novels. It's very colourful and potent, but cartoonish, almost with exaggerated aesthetics that complement the idea of everything being a glorified memory of Silas Greaves quite nicely. The unrealistic visuals complement the unreliable narrative, embellished to be as dramatic looking as possible. It was an unexpected switch up for the series. None of the other Juarez titles went for this approach, opting instead for a more cleanly look, not necessarily to accomplish realism, as it's only really in the past few years that's become a true possibility, but certainly aiming for the respective technological limits versus what they wanted to achieve in those games beyond the visuals. That may not be the best way to put it, but I'm sure you know what I mean. They had an art style, of course they did, but it was more born out of a limitation than here, where it feels like a very deliberate aesthetic. At least universally. Gunslinger commits to a certain visual style that isn't trying to emulate reality in any way, and as a result is consistent in its look because it's something reliably achievable regardless of what's on display. The visuals support the unpredictability of the narrative, the ever-changing level layout, the abrupt occurrences that would seem jarring if the game were in any way attempting to emulate reality feel right at home here. The visuals become a tool for the storytelling just like everything else. It isn't just a finish, a final look that has no purpose other than to be seen. There are moments where the flow of gameplay is slow to a crawl when Silas is interrupted, when Steve falls asleep, or when Silas gets up to leak his self-described one-eyed snake. The art style complements this by washing out the colours in these moments, bringing the pace down to almost a pause, having us loiter in the same area while we wait for Silas to resume his storytelling, and just appreciate the aesthetic. When the level transforms through his self-corrections or interruptions, the visuals find a way to make such sudden, abrupt transformations non-disruptive. The interruptions become a welcome addition to the flow of the game versus the chaotic, agonising, anxiety-inducing, tiresome interruptions they could easily have been. As for the cutscenes, I really like the still image drawing aesthetic to them. It is very much so the reuse of far less doodles than there first seems to be, if you pay attention. But that plays into the overarching sense of mystery regarding why Silas Greaves is being so evasive about the truth. Another art choice I think I noticed was that we never actually see Silas's face fully. It's always obscured, either by his hat or shadows. You never see his eyes, you can't tell if his face is sincere or not. It plays into this idea of a mysterious stranger. Even in the gameplay cutscenes, we're never privy to a clear shot of Silas Greaves. The cutscene visuals when they crop up in the gameplay segments are pretty cool as well. Typically they're used to introduce characters, and they blend just being gameplay cutscenes with that comic booky style, through which the game injects a lot of character. There's a constant effort throughout the visuals to ensure every moment here is memorable, and considering the game is incredibly fast-paced and we can't get too familiar with the characters we're effectively taking down at a rate of knots, the game leans into its art style, particularly in its cutscenes, to ensure each villain feels unique, and every moment could be of importance in failing actually being it. It all comes together to serve to embed you in the blurring between fact and fiction in the West. Sure, were I to dream up a critique, I'd say it's very contrasted by default, but you can lower that easily in the settings, and sometimes it can be hard to make sense of what's going on, in particularly action-packed moments especially. But once you get used to it, it does become easier despite being perhaps a bit overwhelming at first. but that can be like any game. As for my commentary on the soundtrack, I'll throw that in here. The game's music, some of which has been gracefully recycled from previous entries, is genuinely incredible. I can't use any of it for copyright reasons. For some games you can get away with using the score in YouTube videos, this just sadly is not one of them. So you'll have to make do with some Western-akin tunes from a sound library I can use and take my word for it, or you could look it up. The soundtrack slaps. Makes you want to neck 25 whiskey, smoke a cig and shoot the closest man with a pretentious mustache. Proper blood pumping over the top tongue-in-cheek music. I mean, it's the bare minimum for a Western game to have music that makes you think, f*** yeah. And that's exactly what Call of Juarez Gunslinger's score set out to do, and accomplished, even if some of it was carried over from previous titles in the series. Overall, the art style is a stroke of genius. It really helped with the smaller game approach of Gunslinger, focusing the narrative through the concepts it wanted to expand upon, and its otherwise arcadey nature. The only thing I wasn't convinced by was the border around the edges of the screen at all times, but I can understand how it sits with the rest of the vision. All things considered, if you want a good example for how important art style is for a game, this is where you should look. Call of Juarez Gunslinger's gameplay is ridiculously fun. It's a smooth, fast-paced run-and-gun first-person shooter, so it feels comfortable to run at high speeds and shoot even faster. The game's very aware of its fast-paced nature and is careful when it slows down for narrative purposes, but the gameplay is clear, visually distinct, and if anything, quite easy to adjust to even on the highest difficulty. The gun selection is incredibly limited. You have a few variants of revolvers, a sawn-off shotgun, a full-on shotgun and rifle, and that's about it. You get gold variants down the line if you max out your skill trees, but they're just the same guns but with more damage, less recoil. You can shoot people or melee them. It's nothing spectacular in the actual combat gameplay regard. Where the game really makes its mark is in its delivery. It isn't just the same as every other shooter. You obviously have your classic slow down time option or concentration mode where your enemies get highlighted in red and you can dispatch as many as possible until your meter runs out, and that's pretty cool. But you also have a meter for your sense of death, where if your health is low and an enemy fires a fatal shot at you, you can dodge it. And as you upgrade your rudimentary skill trees, fire a shot straight back. Doing so seems to heal you, which gives you a buffer until the meter recharges. Slow motion dodging bullets is pretty cool whenever it crops up. It adds to the unrealistic nature of Silas Greaves' tall tales, and in gameplay enemies will react to you having pulled off the impossible, which is also exhilarating. Now the whole point behind the combat, of course, is to be smooth, to build up as high a score as possible, run as high a number up as possible, and XP multiplies so you can level up quicker. The entire point is to build up kill streaks in a short time period, so cover isn't necessarily a thing. That's why you have that awareness of death meter, so you have more liberty to run and gun. So why didn't you take cover at any point in this story, Mr. Greaves? Well, you see, Dwight Eisenhower, the real Dwight Eisenhower, cover is for dickheads. Now the skills are fairly straightforward, divided into 3 categories. Gunslinger perks focus on speed, damage and dual-wielding revolvers, and it's the one I tend to prioritise first, hence the game's name. Ranger focuses on the long distance, aim which is handy for when you're using a rifle, and of course a perk where you can split thrown dynamite to land in multiple spots and deal more damage. Finally, Trapper focuses on close quarters combat. Shotguns, in other words. Nothing beats a good shotgun to the abdomen. You know, often I can find skill trees to be tiresome, but on the average playthrough of Call of Juarez Gunslinger, all 3 of these trees will be almost maxed out by the end of one run. So a quick New Game Plus blast to complete the lot never goes amiss, then a third New Game Plus run on True West difficulty, while absolutely stacked out, is stupidly fun too. It's such a slight way to achieve replay value, but considering how short the main story is, and how gripping it is the first time around, I do think it has some off the back of incredibly simple things. Now, this game's enemy variety is quite simple. Enemies come packing different guns, some use outhouse doors as shields. It's a shame there's a hole in those for me to shoot them as easily as anybody else, and in the later game you can just throw dynamite past the ones that use more sturdy doors, and then shoot the dynamite and that'll deal with them. Sometimes you face armoured shotgunners, aiming for the eyes makes for an easy kill there. There are very few enemy archetypes in this game that you're going to struggle with, although not taking cover when faced with a lunatic on a Gatling gun is naturally not a winning combination. There are a couple of variants of boss fights, the first of which being duels. I find the general consensus online is they're a bit iffy, but I've always found them to be incredibly smooth and satisfying to deal with. The duels work with 2 separate meters you need to fill until time runs out. You don't have to hit 100% on either, you just need to get the numbers as high as you can. Focus and speed. Speed dictates how quickly you'll be able to draw. It also seems to hold sway on how much time slows down, and you basically need to wiggle your hand over your gun to fill it up. Simultaneously, you need to build focus by using the other stick to focus on your foe. Doing so zooms in, so I assume focus affects your overall aim and increases your chances of a clean shot. God knows how that works on keyboard and mouse. I can't imagine that's fun, but with a controller it's fairly straightforward. You can also draw early, be dishonourable if you fancy that advantage, but I've found timing honourably to be fairly easy, especially with a bit of practice. Sure, the first few times on my first playthrough back in 2013, I probably killed everyone dishonourably. Now, with a bit of time, the trick is to just relax, let them begin to draw, then you can draw easily, and if your speed and your focus are high enough, they still don't stand a chance. Now, ballsing up in one department isn't the end of the world, as dishonourable kills in duels will only affect your score bonus. Also, once guns are drawn, you can dodge bullets, though this relies on a high speed, something you'll find especially important when facing John Wesley Hardin, as when facing him, Silas conveniently forgets how to aim, so you'll have to wiggle past a couple of his shots before the reticle chills out and you can finally shoot him in the balls, which is the only way I've seen this done. Now, aside from that duel trying to do something different, the duels otherwise are quite reliable. It's even quite fun to duel a couple of enemies at once. This happens twice, once as a 2-on-1 and another as a Mexican standoff. If dueling as part of the story isn't enough, there's even a mode where you can just do back-to-back duels, though you can only die so many times, and you have to win the duels honourably or not bag any points. But overall, I quite like the duels. As for the more open gameplay boss fights, these are also quite common. They aren't abundant to the point where the lack of inspiration is apparent, but they are games of taking cover and avoiding Gatling fire before firing shots, throwing dynamite and the like, or simply running around an area to avoid getting shot by a man who can take more bullets to the face than the average person typically can. With one of these, the damage sponge boss fight becomes part of the storytelling, as Emmett Dalton was historically shot 23 times during the Dalton raid in Coffeyville, where we face him, a fact that is raised, to which Silas simply states,
Well, Dwight, who do you think put all those damn holes in him?
I'm not sure I believe they were all to his face, but damn you game for using facts to justify a dodgy boss fight. These fights aren't too hard, but they do sit in an iffy sort of position when compared to the pacing of the rest of the gameplay. It's an incredibly fast-paced game, and none of these boss fights are necessarily slow, but they're just noticeably a bit slower paced than the rest of the game is. They often rely on you being stationary in a game that for the most part has you moving at high speed. From a certain perspective, it could be a welcome change of pace, but when part of the arcade appeal is stacking up a silly score, I'm not sure what the idea is behind having segments that break that. Fortunately, this problem is entirely negated by the purpose-designed arcade mode that allows the main storyline to comfortably break away from breakneck pacing. But I'd still say the boss fights sit a bit funny considering they don't necessarily offer much of novel gameplay value. They do add variety, so you're not always ending every mission with a duel, and the unique environments and differences in weapon of choice of your opponent do play into it. But they don't pose a challenge, unique or otherwise. In exchange for these slight drops in pace, they're just people who can inexplicably eat more bullets than average. These aren't things that subtract from the game's overall quality, but they don't necessarily add to it either. The fights at the very least aren't agonising for the sake of it, so there's no real gripe here. They exist to inject some variety so the levels aren't predictable, and I can respect that. It's just a shame they don't have as much flair as the duels do. But it would be wrong for me to outright say their inherent mindlessness is out of place. After all, the game is intended to be mindless fun, satisfying shooting mechanics condensed into fast-paced levels of non-stop slaughter. So overall, the gameplay doesn't deviate much from combat, but when it does, it's throwing you into unique scenarios such as the odd landslide here and there. It's informing you of a nugget of truth nearby that you need to spend a little bit finding. Maybe you're graced with a Gatling gun with unlimited bullets on occasion. It's a great way to feel like a power-mad lunatic as you rack up a frankly unbelievable amount of kills and experience, and fire indiscriminately in the general direction of your enemies. Despite the game's limited pool of what it can do to keep you invested, it's never too afraid to shake things up a bit, just enough to make what you're doing presently feel different to what you were doing before, even if more often than not it hugely isn't. A lot of the time, the gameplay being a constant spoon-fed portion of the narrative allows it that diversity that it needs, and it's perfectly okay on that alone. But other times it's in the environments, how they change, how where you are now is different to where you were before. They go the furthest in making a constantly renewed experience. And I wouldn't say that's a bulletproof setup in how it works, but the game doesn't outstay its welcome lengthwise for you to find out how flawed that might be after 10, 20, 30 hours. To find out how much of this game you can stomach, I find you have to do multiple playthroughs. The simple deviations work for it. Furthermore, the game thrives on simple, and the arcade mode is a testament to that. Basically, you run certain levels, environments, or at least select parts of them, as quickly as possible to build as high a score as you can, by ensuring that your streak remains running for as long as possible. The first run of any level here, you can expect your score to be dismally low, but as you get used to playing these levels, that's when it gets higher and higher. For the highest of scores, you need to keep one streak running more or less from start to finish, throw in some creative kills and as many headshots as you can muster to really get that multiplier compounding. Sustaining one neat streak from start to finish is obviously the aim of the game. To do this, you've got to time your reloads, your use of concentration, your use of your depth perception, and of course, be as accurate as possible. When these things come together, which is not an especially massive ask in such a smooth shooter gameplay system, it becomes an incredibly satisfying game mode. Combine this with a bonus for being utterly rapid and you'll be amazed at how high your score can actually get. Then of course you get a star rating to know if you're in the ballpark of whether or not your score is what the game would consider good, only for the game to shatter your newfound self-confidence when you look at the leaderboard. I noticed Zanyverse had a particularly high score on most of these, at least by comparison to myself, so I had to beat him. For him, I'm sure this game was but a distant memory, but for me it was war. This cheeky little Belgian has kept my family in his basement for years, making me party to his projects. I couldn't let him have this too. First step, call Juarez Gunslinger arcade mode. Second step, I'm taking my family back, you can't stop me. Oh, that was easy. Yeah, it's fun. The arcade mode is a great way to kill a few minutes here and there. I have no idea how some people score in the millions on these, but I see some of their usernames are censored on the leaderboards at suspicious amounts of characters. I wasn't born yesterday, I know what this means. Although as a bit of advice, I don't suspect giving yourself a vulgar Steam name is going to score you bonus points, but I suppose that'll be for someone other than myself to try. Call Juarez Gunslinger's gameplay is exactly as I described it before. A short few hours of wild, fun madness. Everything it needed to be, it is. And for the pure moment-to-moment enjoyment, I simply cannot recommend it enough. To conclude, hopefully I've reasonably articulated why Call Juarez Gunslinger is an utterly fantastic game. It most certainly needed to be when it released in 2013, after all the cartel was so unbelievably bad that Techland at the time needed a victory. Gunslinger may not have been a fully priced AAA game. It may have had a smaller budget, but this game had a massive impact. From its delightful art style to its magnificent storytelling, rendered complete with its whopping gameplay. Gunslinger is a far better game than anything that slaps you with a Ubisoft logo upon startup has any right to be. But was it a true return to form for the series? I have no idea. There hasn't actually been a Call of Juarez game since. Could there be room for one now? I'd be down. After all, Gunslinger is some of the most fun I've had in a first-person shooter. I distinctly remember Bound in Blood being a good time as well. I don't remember playing the first one at all, but I have played the cartel, and that was a mistake. But if we forget about that for a minute, there's a strong franchise here laying dormant. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that has such a high opinion of Gunslinger. I've seen people call it underrated so much at this point I'm not actually sure it is. So I'm sure I'm not alone in saying I'd be grateful to see another entry to this series. Even if only to prove the cartel didn't kill the franchise, and Gunslinger, no matter how good it was, couldn't save it. Now I personally don't know what that would look like. And if it never comes to be, at least we had this blast to appreciate. The absolute roller coaster of a drunken old man walking into a bar and claiming he killed everybody famous in the Wild West, before shooting the bartender as well and leaving. Call of Juarez Gunslinger is an absolute gem, a spectacular game, one I've come back to repeatedly over the years. So that's my recommendation. For two of your finest squints, you could be in for a wild ride. So if you've never played it before and you find yourself vaguely into the same games as me, pick it up. You won't regret it. And that brings me nicely to the end of today's video. I'd like to thank you all for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. Only if you want to, of course. I'm not in the market of holding people at gunpoint and expecting them to stick around if they don't enjoy what I do. It would, after all, be bad for business to go to prison. And maybe pop me a follow on some social media if you're into that stuff. I don't post much about videos over there, I have to be honest. But you'll see plenty of dog pictures, and quite possibly a picture of me losing my dignity in a Fiat 500. But look, with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, please, take care, and goodbye.